For decades, I have been a huge fan of Games Workshop wargames. From 40k to Necromunda to Mordheim to Spearhead and Kill Team. I've been into all of it. I love the lore, I love the games, but most importantly, I love painting the minis. One of the most recognizable characters from the Games Workshop IP is the SpaceMarine. Over the years, I've become familiar with the SpaceMarine since I've painted plenty myself. But then I recently played the very excellent SpaceMarine 2 and decided I want to make a 2-foot tall SpaceMarine. But it has to be posable. I want to be able to build different weapons and pose them using different loadouts. Kind of like a big Barbie doll. Not to mention all the doodads, the pouches, the belts, the straps. It'll be so cool. In order to do this, I'm going to need a posable skeleton that will essentially wear the Space Marine's armor. I want the proportions to mimic a Primaris Space Marine, which has very different proportions than the original, smaller Space Marines. And we'll need it to be bendable where a Space Marine is bendable, obviously. Okay, so here we have a good representation of the armature. The red obviously is the armature wire, which is made of aluminum, and it bends exactly in the points where a Space Marine would bend, including the foot. Let's do a small proof of concept to see if this will work just by doing the hand. Because making just the hand will entail all the same things I'll need to do everywhere else. The skeletal armature, the black undersuit, in this case being the glove, and the armor on top of the glove and how that gets attached. So I began by creating a palm model in Fusion that has built-in knuckles and the appropriate size holes to run the armature wire through. Then a section of knuckle with some gaps on the bottom, which will leave room for armature to move into when the fingers curl. I pulled that design to all 3 sections of the finger, then created all the other fingers for the full hand. Now let's quickly print these, which will go pretty fast because they're small. Now the hard part, prying these little bits off the bed without stabbing myself. Now I need to get the armature wire into the palm and out onto the other side to the right length. As I do this, I'll add the finger bits to each section of protruding armature wire. Everything seems to fit right, so I'll start hot gluing these in place so they don't slip. I like where this is going, it seems to be working great. Until I get all 4 fingers and a thumb. Now I'll use the skeletal armature hand to trace out a pattern for the glove. I got this black fabric that has a bit of a sheen, which I think is going to be a good contrast between the armor and the undersuit. I cut out a small piece and I'll transfer that pattern over to it. I'll need 2 halves, one for each side of the glove. And once I cut those out, I'll hand sew both of these together. Now I'm pinning the 2 halves together so they don't slip. I'll remove the pins as I sew the sections. I watched a show while I was sewing. Now I'll need the thumb, which in retrospect I should have sewn on before sewing the 2 halves of the glove. This is the thumb pattern that I can use later to make the opposite hand's thumb.
20 minutes later.
Then I need to flip it inside out, which was easier said than done. I had to use a dowel to push the glove out from the inside. Now let's sort of pull it over the skeletal hand. I'll have to remove the glove later in order to sew on the armor, but I just want to see how successful we are so far. Looks good, kind of like a cursed monkey's paw or something. Also, a little bony. I may add some cotton in there to beef it up later. Okay, the hand armor. Back to Fusion 360, I've got the SpaceMarine hand pieces that I found online. They are in gaming resolution, so they can run in a live game engine, which means they'll be too tessellated for me, or low res. I'm going to need to smooth that out in ZBrush. The knuckle pieces need to somehow attach to the hand. I think the best way to do this would be to put small holes in the armor, and then run thread through that and secure it to the glove inside. This means I need to put holes in the knuckle pieces, so I can do this later. Notice the squarish holes in the finger armor? That's about the right size to accept the hand and the glove, hopefully. Finger sections will only get one each, and they need to be close enough to the edge that I can get a needle to it. And for the palm cover, I need 2 for each side for stability. The most important thing I'm doing in ZBrush is smoothing the surface of the model so that they're not faceted like they were in the game model. But while I'm here, I may also accentuate the damage a little bit, just to make it more obvious in the final print. I'll also sharpen some of the edges and just generally zhuzh it up since I already have it in front of me. I'll do this for the hand cover and all the finger joints. Okay, in my eagerness, I printed the palm armor horizontally. This means the print lines will be terribly obvious, so I'm going to redo that. I need to sand the insides a bit to make a bit more room for the armor if any of them are too tight. I've got the first 3 knuckle pieces on. Take a look. And it bends, so that's kind of promising. Okay, now let's put the rest of the knuckles on and see what that looks like. Hopefully the fingers can still flex naturally. One of the biggest concerns to watch for during this whole process actually is the bulkiness of the armor. In games and movies, the armor can look natural because it has no actual mass, like it can literally cross past itself and it doesn't really matter. But when it's real, that's obviously a very different story. More on that later in the project as I encounter it in the full larger model, though hopefully not. The thumb joint was particularly stubborn. I spent a lot more time sanding the inside of that one. Here's what the hand looks like with all the knuckle joints on. Now I need to prime the knuckles, but before I do that, I want to mask the inside of the fingers so I don't add any more thickness to the joints. So I roll up some paper towels and put the joints on that. Now that the inside of the armor is protected, I can spray. I'm laying out all my paper towel fingies and going to town with primer spray, meaning I'm spraying it liberally. For this, I'm using my trusty Rust-Oleum primer, which has a little car on the label. But here's the curveball. To create a heavy metal texture on the armor, I'm going to throw down some spray adhesive over the primer once that dries. Then, once that dries, I'm spraying primer over it again to seal in the texture. Can you see some of that texture coming through? Think like wrought iron. Now it's time to spray a chrome layer that we can reveal later. Okay, here's how I normally do paint scratches. Vallejo liquid mask. This stuff starts pretty watery and I apply it where I want to later reveal the layer underneath. In this case, I would be revealing the chrome. I'll put this on all the places where the SpaceMarine's hands would make contact with enemy faces and just daily wear. I add a bit for each finger, making sure not to be too repetitive and even with my coverage. Once that's dry, I'm going to finally paint the finger armor blue, the color of the Ultramarines. Ultramarines are the most popular faction of Space Marines in Warhammer, and because there's so many other factions that players pick, it's also probably the most ridiculed. Ultramarines are kind of an ultramarine blue, which makes for a potentially ridiculous looking soldier, but I think they managed to look pretty serious in the end. Quick reminder that I'm editing out all the trouble I had with my airbrush as always. I grabbed this fun plastic tray from some object we bought, and I'm using it to lay the fingers down while they dry. Now, I'm doing another fitting of the armor so I can mark how the pieces align to the glove. Did I mess up the finger order? I think this is probably right. Okay, I had to figure out how to mark the glove, and I needed something thin enough that I could run through each hole. So I found a very thin piece of metal, touched it to some paint, and marked all the positions of all the hand gauntlet pieces. Okay, now that we're done with that, I'm going to remove the pieces, and then I have to carefully take the glove off so I can sew them on. And then I got sidetracked and started peeling off some of the masking, but you can't blame me because it's kind of fun. I've got the armature hand, the glove, and the armor pieces, so the only thing left is to put them together. Bad news, gang, I lost some of my thrilling sewing footage, so we'll pick it up a little into the process. I've done way more hand sewing with needle and thread than with a sewing machine, so I'm not entirely out of my element here. If you notice my needle is curved, that will allow me to go through the armor and right back out. Okay, I won't sew each finger on camera. Let's just say it was a pain and it took a good while, but here we are. Now to carefully shove the skeletal hand back in the glove. Dang it, I had the tip of the thumb break off because I put the hole where the thread goes through too close to the edge of the model. So I'm going to hand screw a new hole higher up in the tip and sew it on now. Dang, look at that. Never thought I'd see it. So much sewing. Finally the whole hand. Now that that's done, let's do some posing to see how it holds up. Alright, passes the test, not bad. But what it really needs to do is be able to hold stuff. So let's bring in a couple of test pieces that I made to test the hand's ability to grip. First, the mighty chainsword. The chainsword is a classic Space Marine weapon. It was used liberally in Space Marine 2 to great effect. And here's mine, made to the correct size for a 2-foot Space Marine. I got the gold skull and real leather wrapped handle and pretty sharp chainsaw teeth. Can the hand hold it? I just need to get all the fingers in there and make sure it's really squeezing that handle. And it holds. Honestly, thank God. Later on down the line, we'll also need to make sure that the arm can hold the hand while it's holding something. But for now, success. Okay, I've got another weapon to test with. The Space Marine's heavy bolt pistol. Okay, the one I made is admittedly brand new, and not as worn as the one in the game. It's not as awkward as the long chainsword, but it is a bit heavier. I've got it gripping the handle of the bolt pistol, but will it hold? Yes, another success. Here's the first-person view. Now that I know that the basic process works, the armature construction, the soft body sewing, how I attach the armor pieces to the soft body, I can move on to the next part of the project. Though, full disclosure, while I was working on this, I was also working on modeling the main armature. It's about 2 feet tall. And I have a plan to run the armature wire through each section, just like we did with the hand. So in the next part of the project, I will show you how I create the armature for the entire Space Marine, how I sew the whole bodysuit, and then how I attach a couple of pieces of armor for testing onto that soft bodysuit. So make sure you like and subscribe so you don't miss the next video.